Good afternoon, everybody. This meeting of the Tautog Management Board is called to order. My name is Bill Hyatt. I'm the governor's appointee from the state of Connecticut, the current chair of this board, and this is my first meeting as chair. Since we are no longer doing a roll call, the first item is approval of agenda. Does anyone have any additions or modifications? If so, please hand on the screen.
I do not see any hands up.
Okay, so seeing none, the agenda is accepted. Next order of business is the approval of, yes?
I'm sorry, Tom Foti snuck his hand up in there.
Sure, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I would just like some discussion about, as we're going to have with summer flounder, black sea bass, about extending the season to recover from the losses that we had in the earlier part of the season. Right now, because charter and party boat fleets are still closed in New Jersey, and I assume in New York and a few other states. And how do we basically handle that situation by maybe using conservation equivalency?
Okay, Tom, so we will put that on underneath other business towards the latter part of the agenda. Anything else, Tony?
That is all, Bill.
Okay, so next is approval of the proceedings from the October 2009 board meeting. Any objections or changes or edits? Again, please raise your hand on the screen.
I do not see any hands raised.
Okay, seeing none, the proceedings are accepted. We can move to the main item on the agenda, which is consideration of Rhode Island conservation equivalency proposal. In brief, what Rhode Island is proposing under conservation equivalency is to increase their creel limit for tautog from 5 fish to 6 fish for the charter sector only, and only during the October 15 to December 31 season. Board approval is required. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Kirby, and Kirby will do is provide more detail on the proposal and review that's been received from the plan review team, the technical committee, the law enforcement committee advisory board. So Kirby, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right. Just bear with us as we switch controls to get the presentation up. All right, hopefully people can see that all right.
Looks good and we can hear you.
Excellent, thanks, Tony. All right, so I have just a brief outline for this presentation. I'll review the Rhode Island proposal and then go through the Commission's conservation equivalency policy. After that, I'll give an overview of the plan review team's assessment and summary of the Rhode Island proposal, and then, as Bill had noted, provide a summary of each of the different committees that reviewed this proposal, in addition to the PRT, which is the technical committee, the law enforcement committee, and the advisory panel. And after that, it will be for this board to consider management action on the proposal. So as Bill noted, we received the proposal from Rhode Island. Specifically, it's requesting a separate bag limit by fishing mode during the fall season of October 15th through December 31st. So what the proposal is outlining is an increase of 1 fish in their bag limit for the party charter fleet. And so more information, if you're looking for background information on the proposal, rationale, is in the meeting materials, but I'm going to try to give you guys just an overview of some of the key salient points. In particular, the proposal outlines that Rhode Island, specifically their party charter sector, has been negatively impacted by the measures implemented under Amendment 1. They find that they are disadvantaged in marketing fishing trips, and that since the measures have gone in place, they have seen a decrease in their fall winter trips due to reduction in the bag limit, as prior to 2018, they had these measures of 6 fish bag limit in place. In terms of part of the justification for why the proposal should go forward, they indicate that, the party charter sector makes up a small percentage of Rhode Island's total recreational catch. And with the proposed changes in the party charter sector, this would increase Rhode Island's total harvest by less than 1% of the state's entire harvest in 2018. So it's another important item that they wanted to highlight, which is that regional measures currently are not quite the same between Massachusetts and Rhode Island in the Maury region, as we refer to it. Massachusetts has a summer Tautog season, whereas Rhode Island does not. But as I said, more information can be found in the meeting materials on the proposal. So for today's meeting, we thought it'd be helpful for this group to get a brief overview of the Commission's conservation equivalency policy. So specifically in this instance, because the proposal was submitted outside of the normal implementation plan process, it followed a slightly different timetable than what we would see for other proposals when an addendum or an amendment is approved by the board. So we received the proposal towards the end of February, and at that point it was through the Commission's process up to the board chair to decide whether the board would review the proposal. Bill Hyatt determined that it should go forward and being reviewed by the subsequent committees, and so he submitted the proposal to the PRT for their review. And once it got to the PRT, it's for them to review against the information that's included in the conservation equivalency policy guidance document that's on our website. So within that document, there's standard information that we look for in all proposals that are submitted. And so the PRT evaluated the proposal against those standard pieces of information. After that, it was their task to determine which committees needed to review the document further. And so they asked the TC, the LEC, and the AP all review the document and provide their feedback for the board's consideration. So once each of those groups had completed their review, we put it all together and it was submitted as part of the meeting materials for today. So I'll get to this at the end of the meeting, but basically today's meeting is about the board reviewing this proposal and considering whether to approve it. And if the board chooses to approve the proposal, then they need to set an implementation date. So next I'll get into the plan review team's review of the proposal. So some of the key things that I'll go through is that, there we go. Was that the initial proposal's rationale lacked information on the number of trips from the party charter sector over time. As you hopefully saw in the updated proposal, which was included in meeting materials, this information was added in. Additionally, the document didn't specifically connect how the proposed measures aligned with the fishery management plan's objectives, and there was not a clear plan outline for how the proposed measures, if implemented, would be monitored for potential impacts moving forward. Next, the group highlighted that it's not, in their view, a traditional conservation equivalency proposal. Harvest is projected to increase, and there isn't an offsetting change in other measures, such as an increase in the size limit or reduction in the season length. Given these considerations, the group didn't find that the proposal was truly conservation neutral. This, in combination with the projected harvest increase, were key things that the group wanted to highlight, as well as that it was potentially more of a change in the regional measures than an actual conservation equivalency set of measures. Specifically to the Tautog fishery management plan, there is language in Amendment 1 that outlines states within the region should communicate with each other prior to making changes to their measures and agree to those changes. So prior to the PRT's review, there was no consultation between Massachusetts and Rhode Island on the proposed measures. And so this was another thing that was highlighted by the PRT. And last, from the PRT standpoint, there was at least concern expressed about the potential impact in evaluating the status of the stock in the next assessment update with this change in regulations. So the TC was asked to review this and provide their feedback, which I'll get into shortly. I will note that, as I mentioned in the previous slide, there was an initial proposal submitted to staff and reviewed by the board chair. And after the plan review team's review of the proposal, the state of Rhode Island went back and updated their proposal and provided additional information. And the revised version is what's included in the meeting materials. So next, just to hit on some of the important points from the technical committee's review of the proposal. There was a discussion on the updated analysis and data used. It was pointed out that mandatory reporting is a requirement for the party charter sector, and it was a question of the TC why this data wasn't used. Rhode Island staff indicated that the requirement had only been in place for 1 year and only provides trip level report data for effort and harvest, but not discards and live releases. Additionally, it was highlighted that in considering whether any additional data should have been analyzed, a comparison of Massachusetts party charter trips to Rhode Island party charter trips may have been helpful. In the revised analysis, total Massachusetts recreational trips targeting Tautog during June through July were compared against Rhode Island total recreational trips during October through December. In considering the analysis and potential increase in harvest, there was disagreement within the group in terms of how much harvest would increase. The proposal indicates that the increase could be approximately 3,176 fish, which is less than 1% of Rhode Island's total recreational harvest in 2018, which was approximately 330,000 fish. Some TC members indicated they didn't think harvest would increase much given a 1 fish change in the bag limit. Others expressed concern that the proposed measures would further complicate the regulations between New York, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and that there would be a 3 fish bag limit difference between those states. One TC member highlighted that this discrepancy in measures could be a significant reason for people shifting their effort out of the Long Island Sound area to Rhode Island during the fall season. More broadly, there was concerns raised about how much change in harvest could be tied specifically to regulatory changes versus normal interannual variability. The fact that anglers could target other species at the same time, such as black sea bass and summer flounder, may potentially increase harvest and effort, but it's unclear if it would ultimately result in significantly higher harvest. As noted by the TC in previous analysis, MRIP data on Tautog is highly variable, with PSCs varying significantly year to year. And regarding whether the proposed measures would complicate analysis to be undertaken in the next stock assessment update, the TC was in agreement that given the stock is considered to not be experiencing overfishing, nor is overfished at the regional level based on the 2016 SPR reference points, the proposed regulatory change doesn't pose a significant threat to the stock status. In considering the potential change to the regulations for the next stock assessment update and whether this would complicate analysis of the 3-year average of the fishing mortality rate, it was highlighted that given the current challenges in conducting the MRIP survey due to work disruptions from COVID-19 this spring, data from 2020 will be difficult to evaluate overall, and that the regulatory change will likely have a less significant impact on the assessment than the disruptions to data collection this year. So overall, the group found that the analysis was acceptable and the proposal contained enough information to effectively evaluate it. As mentioned above, there is a lot of uncertainty about the extent of how the harvest would increase. Similar to comments made by the PRT, many in the group noted that they did not see the proposal as truly conservation equivalency, given there was no offsetting changes to other measures such as season length, size limit, or bag limit for other fishing modes, and therefore they didn't see it as conservation neutral. So next I'm going to get into the LAC's comments. We received feedback from the LAC by email, and Primarily, they reaffirm points that were raised in the January 2020 memo that they produced as part of evaluating proposals for striped bass. In particular, the two key items they hit on was differing regulations by fishing mode and enforcement of regulations on shared water bodies. So specific to the first point, when there are regulations that are further divided out by fishing mode, this becomes more difficult from a law enforcement standpoint to enforce. Having a single size and bag limit for all recreational harvest is easiest to enforce. And the biggest challenge that they encounter when it comes to this differentiating regulations by fishing mode is that when people come back to the dock or marinas, it's not always clear if they were out fishing on a party charter trip or as a private angler. In terms of enforcement on shared water bodies, the different regulations between neighboring states also presents challenges, especially when you have vessels that are moving between different state waters and having fished on different regulations. Generally, law enforcement tries to abide by a strict possession limit such that you are following what the regulations are in the water body that you are currently in. And when you are returning to areas that are different from where you're fishing, that further complicates enforcement. So my last slide in terms of committee summaries is the AP. We requested feedback from the AP and received very few comments, but in particular, we had two AP members who provided their input and expressed support for the PRT's comments, specifically concerned about whether the proposal was conservation equivalency. They found that it was likely going to present a situation where it could create a new precedent for approving conservation equivalency proposals that are different than previously evaluated. And then there was an additional comment that was offered up that was not specific to the proposal, that was expressing concerns more generally about commercial management. So that concludes the committee reports that I was going to go over today. So for the board's consideration at this point, the board can take up whether to approve the Rhode Island proposal, and if so, set an implementation date. So with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirby. Any questions for Kirby?
Bill, you have Dan McKiernan, Justin Davis, and then John Clark.
Dan, go ahead.
Oh, I'm going to pass. I thought you were ready for a motion. I don't have any questions on the presentation.
Okay, I guess next was Justin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is a question that might be best answered by commissioners from Rhode Island, and it relates to the rationale for the proposal. So the phrase that I read in the proposal was that the reduction from a 5-fish to from a 6-fish to a 5-fish bag limit for the party charter sector in Rhode Island, resulting from Amendment 1, created a competitive disadvantage for the sector in marketing their trips. Given that surrounding states are at either equivalent or lower bag limits, I guess I can't understand how that presents a situation in which Rhode Island party charter sector is at a competitive disadvantage for marketing trips. So I'm guessing that the rationale is more related to the sector's ability to attract customers given a reduced sort of bonus advantage over the general recreational bag limits. So in other words, 3 individuals who might plan on going out on one of their personal boats to go tautog fishing could keep 10 fish because of the aggregate boat limit. But if they decided to spend perhaps $300 for the 3 of them, perhaps more, if they were going on a 6-pack boat to get on a for-hire boat, they could go harvest 15 versus 18 fish. So I just wanted to clarify with with Rhode Island folks that that is sort of the rationale for the proposal. And a second question, and I apologize, I'm being a little long-winded here. In the rationale, it was suggested that the industry has suffered a reduction in trips in 2018 and 19 as a result of these regulations, but I'm wondering whether there was any analysis looking at the impact of weather on that. We know that that fall tautog fishery can be really unpredictable when it comes to harvest and effort, and that's often related to how many good weather days there are when the fleet can get out fishing. So those are my two questions.
So those questions were from somebody in Rhode Island. Is there somebody who is prepared to respond?
Jason has his hand up.
Okay, go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks, Justin, for the questions. I think, actually, if I could just take a moment, I really appreciate all of the effort that all of the committees invested in looking at our proposal and making comments. As I was going back through the materials, it struck me how many people, for this change got involved. And so I'm really appreciative of all of that. And that goes all the way to Nicole Aries, who is the staff member in Rhode Island who did the original analysis. So just wanted to make sure I had a chance to say that. To your questions, Justin, there are a couple of spots in the original proposal where I think we didn't word things very well. And so the competitive disadvantage is one of those areas. I think you sort of characterized it well when you said it's not necessarily about competing with the other states, because what you said is accurate. Relative to Connecticut, New York, there are differences that are in Rhode Island's favor, and we were the same as Massachusetts. It really was about going back to the original crafting of the Rhode Island, Massachusetts management structure, and the fact that we ended up we had a spawn enclosure in place, so that's the late spring, summertime closure that we have in place, where Massachusetts has a fish they can keep during that time period. So that was kind of the crux of why we brought this proposal forward, and I'll talk more about that after. So it's not really about the competitive advantage, but what we found was, at the time, this one fish, and this was there was a letter that was submitted from industry in Rhode Island to this fact. I don't have data on it necessarily, but this one fish seemed to be kind of like a tipping point for the industry. And so, sorry about the phone. Hang on one second. So we got rid of we lost that one fish, and they saw a significant decrease in their business. And so, to your second question, Justin, whether that was in effect of weather, we didn't investigate that. Taking the industry information that we received at face value, that they believe it was driven by that decrease in the fish that really impacted that fall fishery for them. So I'll stop there, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jay. I believe John Clark is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jay answered just something I was curious about, was the fact that Rhode Island does not have that summer season, Massachusetts does. Was that part of the original regional plan, or was that Rhode Island being more conservative than the plan? And if so, is that you seem to imply there, Jay, that that's part of the rationale for asking for this extra fish now. And was it just a surprise to Rhode Island that it was had such an impact on the business, that difference of just having the one fish? Thank you.
Kirby or Jay?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, John, for the question. And I think so. Maybe I'll take us back to that point. And if folks remember, that was a big change for Tautog, shifting to that regional management structure. And I was and am a big proponent of that. I think it was the right move for Tautog for lots of different reasons, scientific as well as management reasons. And so at the time, there was this difference of opinion, I guess I'll call it, between Rhode Island and Massachusetts on what to do with that spawning time period. And in the end, to move things forward, we agreed to just have that difference in place where Rhode Island wouldn't have any harvest during that spawning period, and Massachusetts was allowing that bycatch amount of one fish. And so, you know, at the time, it didn't seem like a big difference, and we were going to be the same in the fall, and so that seemed as if it would work out okay. And I think we'd had the opportunity to have that fish in the spawning period, and when we shopped that around to the folks in Rhode Island, they didn't want it. They've always been, you know, really conservation minded with regard to Tautog in Rhode Island, and they didn't want it. They didn't want that fish during that period. They wanted to keep the spawning period completely free of harvest, and that's on the commercial side as well. So, you know, things went, we got into that first year, and that's when the industry reported that they started seeing those, you know, dramatic decreases in the number of trips that they were getting during that fall period. And so that's why we're kind of revisiting this now. And I appreciate the opportunity. I think there was a lot of comments, in particular by the PRT, about this not being truly conservation equivalent. And that's, I think they're accurate in saying that. I guess the context that we were viewing it, though, was in that context where we were trying to account for not having that one fish during the spring and summer and taking it in the fall, and we're just doing it a couple years late.
Hey, thank you, Jay. Tony, are there any others up for questions?
Dan McKinnon re-raised his hand, so I don't know if he has a question or if he still wants to get into the comment section. He took his hand down, so then we have Mike Luisi with a question.
Okay, Mike, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a question for Jason. I'm curious as to, what are your plans for how to deal with this on the enforcement end at the docks? I'm asking because selfishly, we're trying to figure out how we're going to deal with some differences between the charter and private angler sectors in our state with striped bass, and we're working on plans to try to make sure that we can enforce the different regulations on bag limits. So, what are you guys talking about as far as dealing with this when the fish at the dock, and you have different limits for whether people are on charter or private trips?
Go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So we have a couple of additional requirements. Well, I'm sure this is the same for everybody. So there's a license if you're a party or charter vessel. You have a license. So there's kind of the first vetting that occurs by enforcement. Do you or do you not have a license? But then we've adopted in Rhode Island same electronic reporting requirements that that the Mid-Atlantic has adopted for some of their species complexes. So we have full electronic reporting required for all of our party and charter vessels. So that's another layer that allows some enforcement to occur. And I guess those are the two main ones. It's a possession rule, so it's simple enough, I guess, to count fish, but when documenting that they're party and charter vessel, they need to have those other two things. They need to have their electronic trip report filled out and the license on hand.
All right, thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Okay, what I'd like to do right now is close the questions and ask Tony, just for my information, does anybody else have their hand up?
Just Jason.
Okay, well,
Never mind. So no other hands up.
so I'm going to close this to questions from and go to Jason and say, do you have a motion?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Let's get that up in front of me. So I would like to move to approve the Rhode Island conservational equivalency proposal to increase the bag limit for the party and charter mode to 6 fish during the fall season, beginning on October 15th, 2020. So that's this fall. All other Tautog recreational management measures will remain unchanged. And in the motion, you'll see there's a table showing all of those regulations. And if I get a second, I'd like to speak to the motion, Mr. Chair.
Very good. Is there a second?
To second the motion, you would need to raise your hand.
I'll second the motion. This is Mike Luisi.
Okay, so it's moved and seconded to approve Rhode Island Nation equivalency proposal to increase the bag limit for the party and charter 6 fish during the fall season beginning on October 15, 2020. Other Tautog recreational management measures will remain unchanged. And Jay, you said you'd like to further to the motion?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Mike, for the second. I didn't know if that was going to happen. What I'd like to do is start off addressing some of the PRT comments. Their critique was the harshest, and so I thought I'd focus there, and I'll try to be relatively quick. And so the main thing that they brought up in their critique was that this is not conservation equivalent. And so I've said this already, but just to reiterate, the idea with this proposal, it's to account for the fact that Rhode Island is closed during the spawning season, so late spring, early summer, while Mass is still open, and that's our region. It's Rhode Island and Massachusetts. So while we understand that we didn't make any adjustments to account for the additional harvest that we were taking on, the way we were thinking about it is because we've kept that spawning closure in place, that's where we were sort of recouping those additional fish. And so that's the context that that's the equivalency that we were kind of viewing. I also wanted to, Kirby brought this up in his presentation, and it's a fair point, and this is my mistake. I should have consulted with Massachusetts before submitting the proposal, and I didn't do that, and that was an error, and it was wrong. And the reason it happened is I simply ran out of time to get the proposal in and have it get through this process in enough time to actually be viable for this year. And I've already apologized to Dan McKiernan directly for that, and he and I did talk about it. It was after the fact, but we did talk. As far as the mode split goes, which also came up in some of the comments, I, for one, look forward to thinking about addressing party and charter mode in a more comprehensive, whether it is to split the mode off or not do that. I think it's something that we need to address more comprehensively, and we've been talking about that a little bit at the commission. And so I look forward to that. I don't like to piecemeal this stuff necessarily. However, in the short term, during what is a really challenging time, in particular for the party and charter mode, not just in Rhode Island, but everywhere, this is something that we can do to provide a little bit of relief. Again, the industry has indicated that change in one fish, even though it doesn't seem like a big deal, it was a tipping point. So whatever calculus the folks who charter those Tautog trips in the fall, whatever calculus they're doing, losing that additional fish, created a situation where they were less inclined to book trips with our party and charter industry. And then the final point that I'll make is that it's a really small change. The party and charter sector is a small overall proportion of the recreational harvest for Tautog in Rhode Island. And so they're, in general, a small proportion, and we're only adding one fish to the fish that they have available to them. So it's a really small change. And as the technical committee noted, in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to impact stock status very much. So thanks for the opportunity, Mr. Chair, to sort of explain things a little bit more, and that's it for me.
Okay, thank you, Jay. So we have a motion on the floor. We're going to be open to comment session, but before we start, well, anybody who wants to comment, please raise your hand screen. But before we start, a couple things I'll ask. One is be brief. And secondly, I ask that you preface your comments, if possible, by saying up front whether you're speaking in support or speaking in opposition. I think in this format, that'll be helpful for keeping things moving. So again, be brief, and if possible, preface your comment by saying whether or not you're speaking in support or in opposition to the motion. Tony, do we have any hands?
Yes, we do. We have Mike Luisi, Dan McKiernan, Justin Davis, and Jim Gilmore.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll quickly say that I supported the motion as a second for purposes of discussion. It's something that we're dealing with in our state. There is a fine line between what trips can sell for, and I'm curious as to hear what other states are thinking, related to this proposal. So I just wanted to go on record to say that I seconded this motion, not in support, but for purposes of discussion, and I'll look forward to hearing what others have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you. I urge the board to reject the motion for a whole suite of reasons, not the least of which is the strong criticism coming from the PRT. I understand Jason's thesis that the for-hire fleet in the fall needs more fish. If that's true, I think we should examine the stock status and see if both states could adopt a 6-fish limit, not just for the for-hire in each state, but maybe for the private sector as well. And I just would give the board a little bit of history. When we negotiated the common rules for the two states, Massachusetts had a 3-fish limit, a very simple set of rules all year long. Instead, we went with a more of a Rhode Island approach with variable trip limits. And to us, because we really favor access to the resource by recreational anglers, we thought it would be most appropriate to give the rank and file private angler the opportunity to retain one fish per angler, especially when the stock wasn't overfished and overfishing wasn't occurring. And so we urged Rhode Island to consider the same, and that would keep us all on the same page, and they opted not to. And so just to sum up, the notion of trying to reconcile a disparity on rules that was agreed to 3 years ago with benefits only to the for-hire sector, I think is a bad policy. And I'm certainly willing to entertain liberalizing Tautog rules for all anglers and all sectors if it's appropriate.
Thank you, Dan. Justin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to be speaking in opposition to the motion, and I'll just say up front that I'm fully cognizant of the impacts that the for-hire sector is currently facing in all of our states, and it doesn't really give me any pleasure to be sitting here speaking in opposition to something that might benefit the for-hire sector in a particular state. But my opposition, I guess, is tied to thinking about the larger commission process. This proposal is not a true conservation equivalency proposal by design. It's intended to increase harvest by selling more for-hire trips. I do think this is a good faith proposal on Rhode Island's part, and that they're seeking equivalency for a conservation-minded decision they made to keep their summer season closed. However, it just doesn't seem to fit for me within sort of the construct of how we currently understand and implement conservation equivalency. And this, I think, speaks to maybe it's time for the commission as a whole to step back and take a look at conservation equivalency and the guidance we provide. Certainly our recent experiences with striped bass and bluefish this last year suggest the same. And related to that, this proposal also suggests a mode split, and right now the commission has a working group formed to explore the issue of mode splits, again, because that's become a little bit of a hot button issue with what we saw in bluefish this last year. And I think because the commission is, I think, trying to right now develop a more comprehensive policy on the issue of mode splits, that we should probably really think carefully about enacting any more of them in a piecemeal fashion. And I'll also just share that, of course, while Connecticut's not in a management region for tautog with Massachusetts and Rhode Island, we certainly are in a fishing region. We share waters. Currently, our bag limit is substantially lower in the fall for tautog than Rhode Island. I'm concerned that the Rhode Island party charter sector increasing their bag limit to 6 fish will create a real competitive disadvantage for the for-hire businesses in Connecticut and New York, particularly in a year in which I think this sector is going to be off to a slow start under the best case scenario, and the fall season may be particularly important for these businesses to recoup some income. So for all those reasons, unfortunately, I have to oppose the motion.
Thank you, Justin. I believe Jim Gilmore was next.
There you go. Sorry, I had a little trouble unmuting. So, Bill, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually have, I'm sort of neutral on it right now because I have, from a management standpoint, I don't think there's a significant impact in the bag limit change. But there seemed to be enough conversation about is this conservation equivalency or not. So simply, and that's, I guess, the concern I have in the motion, and maybe, the issue that Justin, I think, raised and other people have talked about. So a question, and I'm not sure if this is to you, Mr. Chairman, Tony, or whatever, if we removed conservation equivalence, does it move to approve the Rhode Island proposal to increase it? Does that at least eliminate that thing, or do we have to, or does this have to be proposed as a conservation equivalency measure? Thanks.
My understanding is it does not have to be proposed as a conservation equivalency measure, but that is what Rhode Island has chosen to propose it as. Am I anything, Tony or Kirby?
Kirby, do you know offhand in the plan if it says any requirements of changing regional measures outside of conservation equivalency? And I can look while we have a couple other questions, Bill, so I can, if Kirby doesn't know this off the top of his head, he and I can look it up really quick.
Yeah, so Tony, the main thing, and this was part of the plan review team's review of the plan, or the proposal, excuse me, was specifically language in Amendment 1 that outlines that if the regional management measures are modified at a future date, all states will agree to the new regulations prior to regional implementation. So that's kind of the extent of it specific to the Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Maury region. It's on page 68 of the amendment. It does have more information that I could pull up if you guys want, but I'll see if there's other people who have comments that they want to speak to first.
And Bill, Bob has his hand up, so I don't know if it's specific to this issue.
Go ahead, Bob. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, I wanted to comment a little bit on a couple of folks that brought up the ideas of mode splits, and Justin brought up the idea of a working group. I just want to give a quick status on where that is or isn't, and if that's okay, Mr. Chairman. Sure, go ahead. Okay, great. So just as background, the executive committee formed a working group to talk through this issue of mode splits. The executive committee started talking about this because of bluefish and striped bass and some other mode splits that had come up recently, and they were concerned that it's kind of piecemeal and the commission doesn't have a policy on that. And the idea came up: should the commission have a policy on that? And there's strong feelings both ways. Some members of the executive committee felt mode splits were appropriate and a great thing to have, while others felt it was a competitive advantage, and just because you're paying someone to take you fishing, you shouldn't have more access. And so there's a range of opinions. The group had one conference call, and they asked me to go back and do some more analysis. I've been distracted by COVID and a number of other things and haven't gotten nearly as far as I'd hoped to be at this point. So the group asked me to look into sort of analyzing what it would look like if we split off for-hire fisheries as their own mode or own sector. So I'm doing some analysis on what percentages for many of our popular recreational fisheries, how big that for-hire sector or allocation would be based on historic data. And then also the notion of if we moved sort of collectively toward separating or implementing 3 sectors across the commission's FMPs, how would we do that? The working group hasn't by any means settled on separating out the for-hire. It is a good thing to do or not. They just wanted to see what it would look like. So we're working through that. I'll try to get that group back together sometime in the near future, but I just want to let everyone know that that work is ongoing and it's not complete at this point in time. We're still working on it. Thank you, Bob. And to the question that was asked, to this needing to be conservation equivalency, and Kirby and Tony, please jump in. I'm looking at 4.2.1 in the Int 1, and it says if a state within a region wants to implement different management measures than those within the general procedure within section 4.11, conservation will be followed. So I may be questioning what I said before. That verbiage seems to say pretty clear that if you want to change management measures within a state that are different than you need to do so through conservation equivalency. In your view, am I interpreting that correctly?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I guess we're on track. And yes, it has to go through conservation equivalency. So who was up, Tony, with the next comment?
Okay, next on comments, we have Joe Semino, Eric Reed, Adam Nowalski, and then Dan McKiernan, and then Tom Fody.
Okay, again, we're looking time. I think we need to be brief. So with that, Joe, go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'll be very brief because I think that kind of changes things a little bit. One of the things I was going to ask you was if we would have a minute to caucus before states have to make a decision on this. But I think, judging this on a true CE proposal may change people's call from previously. I like many others, came up on the many others on this board came up on the Tautog TC and spent a lot of time looking at this species. I think biologically, this is a fairly safe proposal, but we've heard from some serious considerations, and we are going to have a discussion on possible relaxations with COVID. So if this was a 1-year proposal and then the region would look to get back into sync, I could see other ways around this, even if this fails. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And yes, we will allow a minute before any vote for caucus opportunities. And what I'm going to try to do is wrap up this debate over the next 5 to 7 minutes. So again, please be brief. And I believe Eric is next. Go ahead, Eric.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I'll be quick. I support the motion. I'm trying to understand how Rhode Island not fishing on a spawning stock is not a bad idea. Maybe we're not conservation equivalent. Maybe we're positive. We're choosing not to fish at a time when those fish are spawning. It's a known spawning time, and we're choosing not to go after those fish, which leads me to a question. Now, if you have fishing for one fish is allowed, what is the sum effect of allowing one fish to be caught? Is there high grading? What's the discard rate? We're trying to avoid all that. Our party and charter boat sector is a very small sector. We have them electronic reporting. They're under some pretty strict requirements already. We're not going to fish on spawning stock. What's the outcome for fishing on a spawning stock by our, apparently we're married to Massachusetts, so I can understand the angst there right off the bat. But I'm having a hard time seeing why this is a problem for anyone. We're not fishing on a spawning stock, and we're giving our small sector of our economy the fish back later in the year when it's not spawning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'll assume that your question was more to make a point than actually present a question for which we don't have at the moment. So thank you again, and move to Adam.
Yeah, thank you very much. I am acutely aware of the impact that one fish bag limit may have on the ability to draw passengers. So I have no doubt that the regulation as proposed here could have a significant impact on those for-hire vessels and what they're seeing, and a positive impact. And there's no doubt that given our current economic problems as a result of health concerns, all fishermen, the for-hire sector specifically, is going to need all the help they can get, particularly this fall. Hopefully we'll be able to fish long before that. I do think it's important that we separate, though, the discussion about our reaction to trying to recoup what we've lost this spring. That's a separate discussion. I don't feel that should be a rationale for doing this, because we've got an agenda item today, and I'm sure in the coming months we're going to have conversation on this species and many others about the potential to recoup what we've lost this spring. So I don't think that should factor into this decision. This decision should be judged solely on the basis of what we've done for the region. I have concerns about moving away from each other in the region at this point. I would prefer to look at this. I'm going to be in opposition to this motion, but that does not mean I'm in opposition to helping Rhode Island and the region this fall as we move into that discussion today and in the future. And then I would encourage Rhode Island to have discussion with their regional partners about how to bring this back at some future time for the benefit of the for-hire group. So I'll be opposed to this, but I'm not going to be opposed to the discussion about what we can do about for-hire vessels and all fishermen as we move into later this year. Thank you very much.
Very good. And Tony, I believe we had one more person queued up to speak, and unless there is overwhelming opposition after this next person speaks, I'm going to close the debate and go to a vote. So assume there's one person, and I just didn't write down who that was.
Yep, it's Tom Fody.
Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, I came into this discussion waiting to hear what everybody said, and there was two things that were said. I agree with what Adam just said, and the second was I agree with what Dan said. We need to help the private boat industry also. I mean, I'm looking at from between 2007 and 2014, not only did I lose a whole bunch of party and charter boats, but I lost 50,000 recreational boats. And the effects on marinas, tackle stores, everybody that depended on those people is dramatic. So we need to be helping both sectors, not just one sector. And that's what I'm looking at. And when Dan said that we should be looking at both sectors, I realized that that's really what's making my decision here. And I can't support this motion at this, but I will look at ways that we can help all fishermen, as Adam said, in the fall because of lost fisheries.
Okay, thank you, Tom. So at this point, we're going to close the debate. The question is adoption of the motion to approve the inland conservational equivalency proposal to increase the bag limit for the party and charter mode to fish during the fall beginning on October 15, 2020. All other conservational measures will remain unchanged. So let's take a 1-minute caucus, and then Kirby, as soon as you're ready, why don't you call the vote?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll go off of your mark.
Okay. 1 minute. Okay, go ahead, Kirby.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. We're going to go north to south, starting with Massachusetts.
This is Dan McKiernan. We oppose the motion.
Thank you. Rhode Island.
Rhode Island is a yes.
Thank you. Connecticut.
No.
Thank you. New York.
No.
Thanks. New Jersey.
Opposed.
Thanks. Delaware.
Sorry, we were still caucusing. Where are we now?
Voting.
Okay. I guess given the uncertainties here, we are opposed.
Okay, thank you. Maryland.
Opposed.
Virginia. Virginia, Pakier, please double check to see if you are muted currently.
Kirby, Pakier is not connected via sound. He cannot speak. Oh, here we go, Pat. I see you now.
Okay, thank you. Opposed.
Okay, thank you. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service?
No.
Thank you. National Marine Fisheries Service?
No.
Thank you. All right, so by my account, I have 1 yes, 9 no's, 0 abstentions, 0 null.
Okay, thank you, Kirby. So the one fails. So that brings us to other business. Now, what we had originally intended was for Kirby to give a very quick update on where we stand relative to tagging. I think we put that off to a future meeting. It was just going to be an update without any question. Tom, you expressed a desire, Tom Foti expressed a desire to about extending seasonal opportunities given what's taking place here. If you can try to do that in 2 minutes, just to tee up a discussion that I think will flow through a number of these meetings, that would be appreciated. So 2 minutes, Tom.
I'll make it fast. You can all hear me? Basically, I think we should basically take a look at this. I don't know whether you want to put together a working group to have this by the August meeting. We have time to do this and look at what we should do using conservation equivalents of the closed seasons that we had. I mean, New Jersey's been closed for the first part of our season. It's already over, and really no private boats were out, and few charter boats weren't out at all. So basically, I feel the other states are in the same predicament, and I think we should basically do anything we can to help by extending the seasons this year in the fall. So that's my suggestion. I'm not sure how we can't do it right now, but I think we should set up something for the August meeting. And I'm just looking for everybody's support on that.
Thank you, Tom. Is there any other business that anyone wants to bring before the board?
Bill, I think to respond to that, Bob has some suggestions.
Go ahead, Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very briefly, I understand where Tom's coming from. I think it's a good idea. It's going to take some technical analysis to figure out what fisheries did occur, what didn't occur. A number of them were open, but nobody was really participating. We hear from some of the southernmost fisheries that their participation is through the roof, and this, doesn't apply to Tautog, but a number of other species. So I think for this species, and we're going to talk about it probably in striped bass and summer flounder and scup and black sea bass tomorrow, maybe bluefish, I think we kick something back to the technical committees, ask them to dig into the data that's available. The effort survey is still going on, so we'll have a picture of how many fishing trips did occur. We may not know the success rate because the site intercept work is suspended, but so I think it's going to take a little bit of thinking rather than just sort of, well, we feel like we missed 2 months, let's extend it 2 months. If everybody's okay with it and you're okay with it, Mr. Chairman, I'd suggest we bounce this back to the TC and have them start talking about it and do what Tom said and bring something back at the August meeting.
Very good, Bob. But the question that Tom was bringing forward has to do with a whole slew of different species. So you're not suggesting we bounce it back to the technical committee on Tautog specifically, are you?
I think we're going to have to do it on a species by species basis almost, yeah. So, Tautog will handle Tautog, striped bass will handle striped bass and those kind of things. But, the tech groups are just going to have to dig into the data that's available for each of the species and see what's there and what's not there. Some fisheries, the seasons haven't started yet, others have. So it's just going to be, species specific.
Okay, so, and this is something that you're speaking about in general for the different, refer this question or something similar to their technical committees. It's not something that requires any formal action that we take today, correct?
Correct. And, the other boards may talk about it and they'll need to task their technical committees with working on it. Obviously, Tautog board can't, task the other ones, but I think, in interest of time, we need to do some analysis before we start, talking about specific seasonal changes and those sorts of things.
Very good. Okay.
Thank you.
Good. Any other business?
Bill, you have another hand up, but I will just add that to Bob's statement that if a state has an interest in having the TC look at certain aspects of the fishery, that you please communicate that to Kirby. So for example, if you knew that your party and charter boat season was closed during this time frame, then you would say, hey, the TC should look at charter boats fisheries being closed in X state. And that can just be sent in an email over to Kirby. And then Bill, Mike Luisi has his hand up.
Okay, very good. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm anticipating that this conversation is going to be had tomorrow with the joint meeting that we have with the council. And to Bob's point, I'm just wondering what's going to, maybe this is a question directly to Bob Beal. What's going to be the most efficient way of dealing with this question? It's going to come up at all the species boards, and there's certainly an interest. I can't imagine that we would handle each one independently and have different tactics or different management measures that we would, or management decisions that we would apply to each board. But is this something that the the executive committee, or is there a place somewhere, Bob, that we can have this discussion about this entire question about extending or changing seasons in the fall to account for issues surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic now, later? Is there some other place that we can have a more robust discussion that encompasses all of the fisheries that we're dealing with, rather than taking this one at a time? Because I'm concerned that we're gonna deviate. All the different boards are going to deviate from one another, and we're going to go in different places. Just a question to Bob, basically. Thank you.
Yeah, Mike, that's an excellent question. Exactly what I was wondering too. Is there a better place or a better way to handle this?
Yeah, because we're tomorrow this is going to come up it's going to come up in each. It's probably going to come up this afternoon with striped bass, and then it's going to come up with bluefish, and then it's going to come up again with summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass. So if we can come to some agreement now very quickly as to how we would message that to the board members, if there's another place and time, and given that we're doing all of this via webinar now, is there a place in time in the near future that we could execute a meeting of the commission, whether it's the executive committee or a business session or something, to get everybody on the same page? I think that would be the way to go, rather than having this argument each and every time a board meets. Thank you for that extra.
Bob, Tony, somebody want?
I'll chime in. This is Bob. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm fine with this bouncing back to the executive committee. The executive committee actually has a call this Thursday to theoretically talk about distribution of the CARES Act funds, the disaster relief money, but we haven't heard the final allocations there yet. So maybe this topic's something they can fill time with. But I think it is a good idea to have one sort of policy approach that's unified across all the species, one strategy that we're going to apply. But once that strategy is figured out, I think there's still going to be species-specific technical work that has to happen, looking at data and those sorts of things. But I think it is a great idea to have one approach, so that one strategy is not applied to Tautog, which is different than striped bass, which differs from summer flounder. So I can work with the chairman of the commission and find some time for the executive committee or a similar group to talk about it, come up with the overall policy or strategy to tackle the problem.
Excellent. That's perfect. And we need to move on here because we're going to be bumping up against the striped bass board meeting shortly. Is there anybody else have any other business? Tony?
Bill, Tom Fody has his hand raised.
Okay, Tom, is this a continuation of that discussion or something new?
It's just a short comment. The Tautog and striped bass are managed by the commission only. So we don't have to deal with the council and NIMS. That's why I was handling Tautog, and I don't know what we're going to do on striped bass, but just on Tautog, we can do this without going through the council system and through NIMS, and we can do it by ourselves. That's why I suggested it that way.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Tom. Tony, is there anybody signed up for public comment?
I'll just give the public a second to raise their hand. If they want to make any comments, to please go ahead and do so. I do not see any hands raised.
Good. Okay, thank you, folks. With that, it brings a close to our agenda, a close to, and we are adjourned.